Welcome everyone to today's webinar. Very happy to have you all here to talk about this topic that is very interesting for me in particular. My name is Angela Hansen. I'm from the OECD Observatory of Public Sector Innovation. And today we'll be talking about stewarding innovation portfolios for collective system change. And we have a couple of cases to share what has been going on in different areas with different governments, and to kind of highlight what is happening with this practice. So just the overall agenda for today, we're going to introduce you to innovation portfolios and stewardship based on some of the work at the OECD. We have a case presentation by Viable Cities in Sweden and a case presentation by Future by Lund. So two examples from Sweden today, spotlight on Sweden. And then we'd like to hear from you as well. So we'd like to hear cases of you doing innovation portfolio management and stewardship, particularly working in a multi-stakeholder environment or an ecosystem. We'll have a panel discussion with our panelists, and we invite you to ask questions in the Q&A. And the chat is open, so feel free to have discussions there, introduce yourselves. If you have specific questions for our panelists today, feel free to use the Q&A. That's where we'll be drawing those questions from. Okay, now that all the logistics are covered, and we'll talk about next steps for this work at the OECD, including the research that we're doing and some community of practice building that we hope to be doing in the future as well. I'm joined by my colleague, Chiara Bleckenwegner, and we're both very, very passionate about this topic. Very happy to dig in today. So why portfolios? This is something that we've been researching for a number of years now. As I mentioned, it is an emerging practice, and it's something that we feel is really key for our governments to focus on in particular. The pace of change that we're experiencing is increasing. The types of problems are diversifying. And this all means that there's no one size fits all approach to public sector innovation. And governments are increasingly expected to handle whatever might come, with the last year being a particularly important lesson in that. And so this topic of portfolios is near and dear to our hearts and core to the practice of public sector innovation. But there's not a kind of a rigorous or standard practice for this. There are a lot of emerging practices, and that's something that we're quite interested in exploring and finding what patterns and examples are things that we want to hang on to. So one model framework that we've used for portfolio management in the Observatory of Public Sector Innovation is our innovation facets model. So this was developed based on some work with governments at the system level, primarily at the national level, but also from the regional and subnational, other subnational governments as well. And really this describes the purposes of innovation in a very broad sense. It's not the only framework. There are many, many other frameworks for portfolio analysis and portfolio management. Ours is not necessarily the best, and we'll hear from some other examples today. But I know that there are quite a few other examples out there. And really it's, I treat it like it doesn't matter which diet that you're on as long as you're doing something. Just attention to this as a topic is going to be better than doing nothing. And the real key here is to be intentional. So really this framework that I'll present is for clarification, sense making, and kind of orienting future action. And then the layer that I want to add on today with our case presentations is, okay, this is great, but how do you do this in a multi-stakeholder environment? How do you, I think, as one of the panelists mentioned, how do you get everyone to the dance floor? And what music do you play? And we'll explore topics such as building legitimacy, doing that collective action, and building and sustaining the momentum around some of these transitions of a portfolio. So this is the innovation facets model in OPSI. Again, this is just one of many, but it's one that we tend to use with our work with governments, and it differentiates between mission-oriented innovation, which is kind of the overall challenges and societal goals and orienting action from a very top-down and directed way, to enhancement-oriented innovation, which is taking existing practices and making them better, more efficient, and more widespread. Adaptive innovation, which is looking at new needs, expressed needs that need to be addressed, and creating spaces for that exploration to happen from the bottom up. And then anticipatory innovation, which is looking at extreme uncertainty and shaping changes based on things that might happen in the future. So it's one thing to have a framework, it's another thing to do something with it. So what we've done over the past few years is taken this model into practice and used it as a framing device to have very important conversations and to be the seed of some action around portfolios. So what does this look like? This is an example from Sweden with Vinnova. We've worked with Asian Pacific National Statistics offices. We've taken this framework in Montenegro, particularly looking at response of the innovation portfolio to crises or shocks. We've worked with the portfolio in many countries. In Norway, where we specifically looked at the relationship between projects and support structures for these different kinds of innovation. In Gipuzkoa, which is in the Basque Country in Spain, they're specifically looking at different types of experimentation spaces and supports for these different kinds of innovation. So we've learned quite a bit about this portfolio reflection process, and this is but one step. So the reflection is clarifying what exists and for what purpose, and we'll dig in a bit to this question of portfolios of what, because that really matters as well. It helps look at relationships between multiple activities and purposes, and what directions could be taken. And so beyond the reflection, I just want to say that this is the first step, and really that's where a lot of the work has focused. This clarification work has helped us back in to a lot of conversations about, well, why is your system set up the way it is? And it's really helped with that clarification and sense-making process. But then there's the conversation about, well, so what? And we'll dig in a little bit to that as well, because transitioning the portfolio, knowing whether this portfolio management activity is kind of worthy of our time, to know what are the outcomes from this. These are all questions that we haven't explored as much, but through the cases today, I hope that we'll get some examples and some examples from you as well. We're also doing some research on this topic, and I'm going to hand it to my colleague Chiara to tell a little bit about the key questions that we are using in this research.
Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you're joining us from this research and also from observing what organizations implementing portfolios are facing. These early research questions which hint at the challenges that you may recognize in your own work. One of them being, what led to the current portfolio? This comes from the observation that when we start trying to understand the portfolio we have, there are all these conditions or requirements that explain why we might be set up a certain way. This could be the policy context, the organizational environment you're operating in, the organizational goals or priorities that you have set yourself. They impact what type of portfolio you have when you start trying to map it. Then often it might not be obvious who is stewarding this portfolio. There might be an explicit role or an implicit team or role or individual who has an overview of the bigger picture or gives impulses. Another question is whether there are strategies and policies supporting each facet, and what are they? What we have observed is that most organizations tend to be very strong in one or two of the facets. For example, if they are a very efficiency-led organization, they would have policies in place to support enhancement-oriented innovation. Or when there has been a recent implementation of a policy that is very challenge-focused, and that area of the portfolio might be particularly strong at the time. But there aren't always explicit support structures. Another question we asked is the current balance of your innovation portfolio indicative of a temporary or long-term trend? Again, we observe that innovation portfolios, of course, aren't particularly particular analysis in time may indicate very well your capabilities or may reflect external influences that are currently impacting what the organization is working on. This leads to the question of, is the balance of the portfolio supportive of the overall organizational remit or public purpose? Because especially as organizations become aware of the portfolio process or start adopting the methodology, they may actually find that the innovation portfolio that they are working with may be at odds with the stated objectives of the organization. And what roles do different ecosystem actors play in shaping the portfolio? This is another observation we found from practice, that it's relatively intuitive, or the first step to understanding innovation portfolio is to look within your own organizational remit. But of course, the reality is more complex, that other organization, external influences, partners impact your own ecosystem. And in fact, innovation portfolios should be looked at from the wider ecosystem perspective. That leads to the question, what roles are needed to steward innovation portfolios, both within teams, within an organization, or within the wider ecosystems? So lots of interesting observations from our research so far that I hope are reflected in your own practice. And back to Angela.
Thank you, Chiara. So in addition to the kind of sense making around what is in your portfolio, there's also this question of what drives your portfolio beyond the contextual factors that you may be also facing. So for instance, in Sweden in particular, the government tends to be quite a devolved structure. So there's a lot of activity at the kind of regional and local level. So that's a factor that is kind of inherent in that context. But beyond that, kind of at this organizational or kind of micro level, this question of what drives portfolio transitions is also an important area that we're looking into. So there are a number of things, everything from scandals to societal changes, technology shifts, all of these things can be driving portfolio transitions, whether it's being managed or directed intentionally or not. And the key question is here, do you have the right mix or options and choices for your context? So beyond this question of what innovative activity is occurring, we also look at which forces, structures, processes, aptitudes, preferences, and circumstances are pushing the innovative activity in different directions. So if you imagine that as different magnets, how are they working and how are they acting in transitioning or maybe even kind of reinforcing certain kinds of activities? And there's always some kind of innovation portfolio, whether it's intentional or not. There is always a kind of mix, but oftentimes it is not this intentional process. It just occurs. And we ask, are we satisfied with the mix of innovative activity the way it is? And what mix should we have? And this question of should is a really, really loaded one that has to do, particularly in the public sector, with legitimacy for whatever direction is pulling. And it's oftentimes related to values and which public values are preferenced over others, which is often quite a political question. So hopefully we'll dig in a little bit to that from the cases today and in practice, and talk about this question of legitimacy, which is particularly important in a collective environment where there's not one organization or one individual that is able to have their hand on all the levers and requires others to play a role. So stewardship at the system level, kind of getting to this collective level. So innovation is going to pull a system in different directions. And the challenge here is this is potentially threatening the overall coherence, compatibility, and interoperability of the innovation activity within the system. And the need for innovation will continuously change. So whether it's guided or not, the question is how much proactivity do we want to add in that shift? And again, no one person or group can completely control an innovation system, but we think that overall, I won't say the word oversight, but the overall view into what's happening is really, really key. And there needs to be some form of stewardship at the collective level. And so we'll look at what this looks like in practice today. I'm going to hand it back to Chiara to talk about this, these areas of emerging practice. And these are areas that there are definitely, well, we don't think yet best practices, but these are areas where we see some patterns emerging and seeing some promising things happening. Back over to you, Chiara.
One of the interesting ones is how to create space or legitimacy for transitioning your portfolio or doing new things before you get started on the work. Once you have gathered the insights, who holds the cards on?
Chiara,
maybe in that case, I will hand it back.
Yeah, sorry. I think Chiara's having a bit of audio issues there. So just to kind of continue on that line, so kind of what is the type of analysis support that exists? So this is a capacity question, and also the decision-making support that exists. And is there a kind of portfolio level assessment of the impact of all of the activities. So what does that look like? And is there holistic and also differentiated support structures based on the different purposes of your innovation activity? So with the innovation facets model, it would be, do you have support structures to kind of support all of the different facets? So mission, enhancement, anticipatory, adaptive. Do you have those holistically and simultaneously? And do you have diverse capabilities and this kind of integrator or connector role? Because when you have different purposes, you also need to look at what is the relationship of all of these activities as a whole so that they're not fragmented. And none of them are too far from the core business of the organization or the core work of a community. And what are those cooperation structures and knowledge sharing systems that are in place for this ongoing sense making and ongoing action? So what if you are not the only one who affects the portfolio? Big footnote here. This is the case most of the time. So even though a lot of our work with the innovation facets model and portfolio management has been at the organizational level with government agencies, oftentimes they're looking at creating changes that go beyond their borders. So beyond the borders of their team, their unit, their organization, or even the public sector itself. And they're looking at what, if we don't have, absolute control, which is rarely the case, how do we advance this work in a multi-stakeholder environment and in an ecosystem? So that's what we're going to dive into today with two very interesting cases. So the two cases from Sweden today are going to zoom in on this question of kind of why portfolios, what's the value for their particular context, portfolios of what? This is this question that I raised earlier about, are we talking about activities? Are we talking about funds? How we're spending our time? What is the what of the portfolio? What are different roles in these multi-stakeholder environments? What's driving collective action in the portfolio and how is that managed? And the question that everybody always wants to know is, how do you evaluate impact in something that is such a complex process and with so many stakeholders involved? So I hope our case presenters and panelists are ready to dive into these questions. I'm first going to start out with viable cities. So we have representing viable cities, Ola Armstrand-Dirks, who is a portfolio strategist for Viable Cities Sweden, Åsa Minos, innovation strategist also with Viable Cities, and Katarina Periversa, sorry if I'm mispronouncing the name, Sustainability, Transitions, and Transformative Innovation Policy. So I'm going to hand it over to you to tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing on innovation portfolio management.
So thank you so much, Angela. I'm just going to start with double checking that you can see my screen.
Looks good.
So thank you so much for inviting me and my colleagues from Sweden to participate in this webinar today. It's really great to see how OECD is developing the field and also inviting researchers and practitioners. And I think that the thinking that you present is pretty much in line with ours at Viable Cities. And I'm also sure that there are many elements to be inspired by that we can use here. So I'm looking forward to pick up some of these in the dialogue today. I have not been able to use the innovation facet model that much, just seen glimpses and trying it out with one particular city in Sweden. But I'm really eager to learn more and perhaps try it more also for our portfolio activities. So I am Ole Armstrand-Dirks. I'm in the program management of Viable Cities. And in my role as a portfolio strategist, I try to understand how we better can align efforts in Sweden towards the mission of climate neutral cities, and then implementing plans that includes a lot of stakeholders. But portfolio management is, as you mentioned, a really an emerging field. So we like to take every opportunity that we can to listen and learn, but also to share our initial findings about portfolio approaches. So again, we really appreciate the meeting today, and we look forward to the dialogue. I would say that no matter what reason you have for developing a portfolio strategy, it would surprise me if not one of the main reasons is a strengthened direction towards something to achieve. This could be on an organizational level, such as a company goal, or it could be on a national level, such as national goals, or it could be in relation to global goals, such as the Agenda 2030, or a certain mission. And I followed the chat a bit, and I saw that there was comments, for example, about health system innovations in Canada and moonshots in Estonia. But whatever direction you want to direct your efforts, activities, partners, and employees, there will be barriers. So barriers in the way of reaching the goals. These could be policy type of barriers, or barriers because of lack of organizational capacity, or pretty much anything else that rather is representing a previous or current paradigm rather than a future that we'd like to see replacing the current system. When working with a portfolio approach, it might be wise to embrace the barriers. The reason for this would be to better know what to focus on. But even though the direction and the barriers can be easily put on paper, it will not necessarily lead towards actual change. Therefore, it can be wise to make sure to work closely together with the most committed individuals and organizations, and potentially to further tie commitments to the direction you're on and overcome the barriers in the way. Because when committed individuals and organizations come together to share a common view on barriers and to learn from each other, they're part of a movement. Such a movement of many will be important if you want to change things from what they are to what they can be. These are some of the thoughts that influence Viable Cities' work on our portfolio approach. Perhaps it can also be valuable for other organizations and initiatives. And to showcase how we are working with this practice, I will leave the word to my colleague Åsa. She will give you a bit more of context and a few examples of our practice. And then we will hear from Katarina, who is also, by the way, a colleague at Viable Cities. She will talk more about the general approach and the learnings that we would like to share from our journey so far within the portfolio and the approach development. So over to you, Åsa.
Thank you, Ole, and very happy to be here and share our experience from Viable Cities. So I'm going to start off by saying that our program, Viable Cities, has the mission of achieving climate neutral cities in 2030 with a good life for all within planetary boundaries. So we're actually in practice working with the mission-oriented approach that is gaining speed in the innovation policy discussion and practice all over the world. And this is about systems transformation. It's about things that involve us all, and that is very, we have a time schedule that is set by our planet. So the program Viable Cities is one of 17 actually, but we have a mission-oriented portfolio of activities that focus on impact vis-a-vis this mission. And all these types of programs as Viable Cities have a call for proposals and strategic activities as components of what we do. We have a budget over 12 years that is about 100 million euros. Actually, we had a slight increase recently in our funding. And the funding comes from 3 government agencies, Vinnova, the Swedish Energy Agency, and Formas. So they have the government's assignment in funding these kinds of initiatives. We have 100 members, organizations representing quadruple helix, so companies, public organizations, academia and research institutes, and also civil society organizations. And why do we need a portfolio strategy at Viable Cities? So the main purpose is to align climate transition and sustainability efforts to contribute to a more impactful way in achieving the mission that we have set for ourselves. And here the holistic and systemic view is key. And today's problems are, for instance, the fragmentation that we have and the projectification that we see in different efforts regarding research and innovation and implementation and scaling up of different types of pathways to a sustainable future. And not least is missing the kind of directionality that a mission approach can provide, and a reflexivity that where we learn along the way, where we can coordinate activities and efforts and investments, not least. So one of our flagship efforts, the flagship effort, I would say, within Viable Cities is what we call Climate Neutral Cities 2030. And this is an effort initiated in 2019, where 9 Swedish cities and their partners are pioneering efforts to accelerate climate transition. So these are 9 cities that you can see on the Swedish map here. And from October this year, this will be expanded to 20 cities. And at the bottom of the page here, you can see Lund, which you will hear from more later on. In December last year, we actually achieved something quite particular. We, during last year, had a process where we evolved together with the 9 cities and 4 government agencies, something that we call Climate City Contract, which is a core part of Viable Cities approach. So here you can see the mayors of 9 cities and the directors general of 4 government agencies, together with our program director, Olga Kordas, at the signing process in December. Well, the Climate City Contract per se is then a document which assigns commitments to both national level organizations, 4 government agencies at this stage, and 9 cities. So it's signed by mayors and director generals of these government agencies. And it's actually a negotiated collaboration for faster climate transition in cities. And if you push the button for me, Olle, one aspect that I would like to highlight is that climate investment, what is actually needed in order to achieve the goal of climate neutral cities and sustainability for 2030. And this is a process. It's revised and signed yearly. So it's something that is actually stewarding ownerships and commitments to the portfolio. We have a certain mechanism for accelerating learning for climate transition, which we call Viable Cities Transition Lab. So this is for cities and municipalities and other types of stakeholders to accelerate the learnings, how to clarify our common direction towards the mission, take advantage of the synergies of different efforts taking place and in the pipeline, and renew decision-making processes and policies. And not least, build dynamic capabilities for change and new practices. And I would like to mention here, since Malin Bergvall posed a question about innovation management, We have an effort also to include here innovation management for transformative systems change together with our innovation agency, Vinnova, and others. So with this, I'd like to give the floor to my colleague, Katarina.
Yes, thank you, Åsa. Hello, everyone. I'm Katarina. I'm researcher. I'm working in KTH in Stockholm and also in Viable Cities in collaboration with our practice there. And I would like, in this like short time I have, I just would like to highlight several learnings which we observe from like experimentation and practice of viable cities, and maybe they also can be points for discussion later in the discussion part of this webinar, or you can maybe react to them in the chat. It would be very interesting to hear back from you. So then on the next slide, yes, thank you. I would like to highlight one first point, which is also in line with what Angela already saying, that portfolio or mission-oriented portfolio, as we say in viable cities, we also call it sometimes transformative portfolio. It emerges as a concept to say about portfolio of portfolios. Because exactly as already was said, that we see that in order to achieve the mission, we need to align efforts and connect efforts through certain mechanisms, maybe learning mechanisms of different actors and on different governance levels. And this is why in viable cities, this idea of portfolio of portfolios is really strongly pronounced, and we discuss always what is the role of viable cities, for example, in building this portfolio and enable this across sectorial or cross-level interactions. And this climate city contract can be also seen as one example of this activity. And one also idea which emerges from this understanding of mission-oriented portfolio in this way is that it might be useful to think about open interfaces or some kind of interfaces between portfolio, how we can enable or facilitate a connection across portfolios. So this is one idea we are working on to maybe further develop the understanding of what those interfaces can be. And another point in the same slide is about what we have written here is a centrality of city level portfolios. And this is because viable cities is working with the mission of climate neutral cities, and it kind of naturally leads to this appreciation and understanding that city level portfolios are kind of central. But maybe to take it to the more general level, maybe this is to say that depending on the mission, you can have certain level more central. So maybe it can be a discussion around this, how your mission and your portfolio are related. And on the next slide, we have collected actually two examples also of active initiatives in this direction of working across portfolios or connecting initiatives of different actors. So one is coming from a more like national level, and this is when viable cities is now aligning efforts and aligning kind of portfolio of activities with another strategic innovation program in Sweden, which is called Drive Sweden. They are both committed to the mission of climate neutrality in cities. And the idea is to connect and align through learnings, through maybe connecting efforts and resources to push towards this mission together. And climate city contract will be also one specific instrument to work on together. Another example is on the international level, and also very interesting initiative can be maybe discussed later in more details, the Climate Smart Cities Challenge. So from one side is a attempt to connect across geographical borders, to have some sort of mechanism to learn across cities in different parts of the world, also organized by viable cities with young habitat, but also is a possibility to try out some elements of new portfolio, like emerging portfolio strategy, as for example, how you define challenges or how you design and implement system demonstrators. So this is the idea to try it out within this challenge context. And then I'm moving to the second point. So here is also was pronounced today already that this is emerging practice, mission-oriented portfolio, transformative portfolio, portfolio strategy, and we need some sort of a sense-making process to figure out, to maybe critically address it and understand what could it be in this new context, in this new collaborative context we are talking about, because maybe we even have some preconceptions. Portfolio is not entirely new concept. It has some inherited inherited ideas. Maybe we have a tendency to think about portfolio of projects sometimes, and that's why we find important to sort of have a critical discussion around this practice. And what we have kind of refined from the viable cities discourse is 7 dimensions along which the sense making is sort of happening. It's basically, maybe I will not go through each of them now, and just on the next slide, we have one example, which is about portfolio elements or nature of portfolio elements. And here it's about asking a portfolio of what question. And we find it fruitful to ask this question and to actually, to think maybe it's not only about portfolio of innovations or portfolio of projects, but what kind of initiatives, or maybe not initiatives at all, but challenges, needs, and barriers, which we need to include into this transformative portfolio. And this is the same idea to apply to other dimensions, to have a kind of critically decompose them and to see what this new practice can look like. So with this, I think I will maybe stop. I will have a couple of more slides, which maybe we will talk about during the discussion part. Yes, thank you. And I pass over to you, Ulla.
And they're trying to find the mute button. So thank you so much, Åsa and Katarina. And just to finish off, sort of these approaches influences everything that we do, but as you sort of might have already figured out, we have just gotten started, and we want to develop a strategy and perhaps even co-own it with others that would be directly linked to the mission of climate neutral cities by 2030. So please see that as an open invitation and reach out to us if you want to co-develop it together with us. So with that, thank you for now from Viable City side, and I'm leaving the word back to you, Angela, and your colleagues at OECD.
Thank you very much. Very interesting work that you're embarking on. Very interested to know more about the learning systems. This concept of, the portfolio of portfolios, I think is really valuable. And, kind of going beyond this projectification, I think the word you used, and looking more at these, different concepts of the portfolio in a more dimension based approach. So really interesting work that you're doing. I want to hear from Future by Lund now. So I'm going to, and if you have questions, by the way, feel free to add them in the chat if they are specific to viable cities, or if you have kind of overall questions that you'd like to pose to everybody, feel free to use the Q&A for that as well. So I'd like to introduce our next speakers from Future by Lund, Katarina Scott, who is a project manager, and Emily Wise, who is an action researcher working on the project. So I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks, Angela. I got all excited and put things up beforehand and then took them down. Now I think we're all set. Can you see the slide in full screen? Great. Thanks so much for having, I'm Emily Wise, me and my colleague at Future by Lund, Katarina Scott, here to talk to you today about also our kind of experiment in progress about working with portfolios and portfolio stewardship, I suppose you can call it that. So as Angela mentioned, I'm a researcher at Lund University, and I work as an action researcher with Future by Lund. And that role implies a bit of bringing in some theories around innovation governance and working with innovation in a kind of an ecosystem approach, but also providing some kind of a strategic advice or support and trying to implement new ways of working. And Future by Lund is an innovation platform at the municipality of Lund, and Katarina will present a little bit more about what the platform is. And then I'll talk a little bit more about why we got into the work of talking and working with innovation portfolios and trying to find some kind of operational approach of working with innovation portfolios at Lund. So Katarina, I'll hand it over to you to tell about the platform, Future by Lund.
Yes. Thank you. So we can take next. So I'm working with sort of in the core of actually trying to drive and build this innovation platform. You might see me as the practitioner in this case. So what we have been doing is during the last 6-7 years is trying as 1 out of 6 innovation platforms in Sweden based on city level, trying to create a new way of tackling all the questions that a city don't care or have their own mandate for. So the most questions is not a city question. It's a much bigger question. We have a lot of bigger challenges and possibilities that we need to collaborate around. So this is the kind of situation where this was set. And Lund is a small city in the south of Sweden. It's a university city. We have a lot of people that knows a lot of things. There are doctors and professors and students everywhere. So it's very much sort of focused around knowledge, and a quite international city as well. So this is our settings when we embark on this. So you can take the next one. So what we have been doing is basically connecting companies, organizations, cities with all the departments and the university and the faculties together. So it's very much a multi-stakeholder environment where we always say we have to accept that we always have fragmentation. We have to accept that no one is deciding over anyone else. The key thing is trust, negotiation, and timing. So we also have to accept that everything moves and there are always gaps. And people, things, projects, and organizations will move in and out depending on their own logic. So this is our setting, and this is a view from when we were working with trying to create a new space node in the south of Sweden, which will actually, after 4 years of work, will open up this autumn. So we can take the next one. When you try to do this, one of the main things that you need is some pictures that can sort of form a frame for how we think together, how we can understand where everyone is, what we do, when we do, and how things works. So we are sort of based between the city and all these kind of external environments. And we have been using different models. And one of them has been the zone model that you can see here, which basically says in the yellow zone, we work with things that we really don't know what we do. We know there is something, no one is owning it. We have to find our ways, and you work with uncertainty and risk and everything. And then you create concepts, projects, participation. You connect people and you end up in the green zone. And when it becomes your own business, whether it's a city or a company, it's blue zone, and they take over. And there is the upscaling. But to do this, we need these framing and the formulas, and this is why we enter in the portfolio way, because how do you work with this overview thinking together? So we can take the next one. Basically, this is what has happened with a very, very small crew based around 4 people and some researchers during these 6 years. We have involved 120 organizations. We have done many projects. Now, when I'm saying this, it's not us as the core team. It's us as this ecosystem, is us in the partnership. And this is what we have come up with. And we haven't been able to measure how much money there have been internal investments put in, but this is what's happened. And of course, we have sustainability and climate as a core, because this is the biggest question that we all share, but no one is alone taken care of. So these are the ways that sort of the outcome that happens when we have been moving along. So we can take the next one. So this is why we want to work with this. We need this new framework, because when we work together, the kind of thinking, reflecting, understanding each other's positions is key to actually go and move into impact. And basically, when you said people with drive, with a mission, with knowledge, with perhaps resources together, you know that they will create impact. So Emily, you're...
Sure. And I think it's really interesting that kind of our reasons why are very much mirroring, Ulla, what you were saying about why Viable Cities is working with innovation portfolios. It's to kind of create some kind of structure or process around identifying these common problems or barriers and opportunities for collective action for multiple organizations. It's curation and strategic development, establishing this movement of the activities and different, not necessarily projects, but different activities across multiple organizations and actor groups, and thematic boundaries, climate and mobility and all these kind of different areas over time. And it's some way, we also view it as a way of communicating both the collective assets and the portfolio of activities, and kind of the strength of the ecosystem in Lund, as Katarina was mentioning, and also some kind of way of bundling the results and of all the contributing actors, and to kind of trace this system level transformation over time. And the next slide is a bit the same thing, talking about what benefits of working with a portfolio approach. We see it as, in one essence, in the most basic of steps that we're working with now, it's establishing a common vocabulary and a frame of reference to what is it that we're talking about. When we say portfolio, what is the portfolio for Future by Lund, or the portfolio for the system? And it's, getting this basic understanding of what it is that we're talking about in order to collectively kind of manage and move that portfolio over time. You have to have a basic understanding, and the basic understanding from various perspectives and stakeholders. So it's not just the academics, it's not just the practitioners at the municipality that Katarina is a team of, but it's the practitioners in companies and other organizations across the whole ecosystem. And we're discovering that it provides a tool for other purposes as well, for visualizing kind of the strengths and the weaknesses. Where do we have gaps in the portfolio of activities? Are we forward-looking enough? Are we having activities in the kind of the fuzzy front end, the exploratory range of activities? And to try to kind of identify holes that you might want to fill, or places that you might want to move across this dance floor or playing field, as we call it. It also provides a basis for kind of entering the strategic discussion. Okay, where do we want to go, we as a group, as an ecosystem? And to do that, where do we want to invest our resources, different types of time and money, and kind of agreeing, this kind of having this discussion to align resources. It also is a kind of a tool to be able to track movement across the playing field. You have these snapshots over time. Maybe an activity is in the fuzzy front end at one part, and then it kind of moves across the portfolio. And I use my hands to demonstrate something that we're using the innovation facets model. And it's also about trying to connect the activities and the projects, or the functions, to the assets in the innovation ecosystem, to try to give, so Katarina and the team at Future by Lund, who work with matching and identifying, tracking ideas and identifying potential, and then matching ideas with resources and assets to move things across the playing field. So the next picture is a work in progress framework for kind of a way of governing this ecosystem, a way for Future by Lund to continue playing this function of a steward, of curating the portfolio of activities in Lund as a place. But they're exiting a project form financed by the Innovation Platform Program at Vinnova. The exiting that project form and becoming more of an institution within the municipality in some form. And there needs to be some structured way of governing this, and governing including stewarding activities over time, but also helping to go in a common direction, setting direction, and then also reflecting and tracking progress over time. So this is the model, and it's this is in idea form now. It's not being put into practice yet, but it's built on three submodels. One is kind of a mapping of the innovation assets, and we're following the Global Institute for Innovation Districts model for that. The second is innovation facets model. And then the third is kind of your snapshots on an annual basis. How do we track this kind of dynamism in the portfolio of activities? And I'll give you a little bit of insights on that at the end, after we go into what is it that we're doing with the innovation facets model. Katarina, I hand it over to you.
Yes, thank you. So what we have been trying is actually to sit down and try to map our portfolios. This snapshot is just sort of what was the team doing at a certain point, what was we involved in, and then thinking that we could actually do snapshots either around themes, around actually a specific area, a territory, a place. So depending on what cut is needed, you could actually try to monitor it. So this was our first tracking of the involvement, and it included both mobility, digitalization, clean tech, methodology that were developed, and we tried together all of the team to pinpoint where our project was, to then be able to have a discussion of sort of what is a good approach when we are actually situated here, because our goal is actually to move it from going from right side to left side, because there you have the implementation and the impact and the upscaling. And in that case, we could see how far had we been moving and were the right stakeholders involved to take over. Because basically what we do is creating the environment for someone else to take over, implement it into their own organizations, and there create the impact. So it's basically impact by proxy. So if you look at it, you could see like from a national level, I would be like, the city of Lund is like a grassroots, we are implementing. And then if you scale it down, the proxy level, the who is doing what, it's different. In our case, it will become the companies and the departments. And we could try to identify gaps, or who could be the next one, who would be the good sort of one to bring into this so they can take over. So you want to go from the exploring side to the more sort of impacting and using side. So we tried this out as a snapshot, and also having this discussion also in our own team, we could see the connections between the digitalization area, the clean tech area, and everyone. So we could actually get a visual map over what was going on that could sort of, and that has helped us, just being us, to see the connections in between. And then we have been moving on, we don't have that snapshot yet, trying to do this an experiment together with our partners, for example, within digitalization or within energy or within mobility, to create the same understanding and visual snapshot also for them. And then having this discussion about stewardship might not be that it is us who are stewarding, but perhaps the stewardship is how do we make impact out of this? So the insights, the reflections is actually for us has been the main key to drive things forward. It's very, another insight that we take from this is when we have been sitting down with the companies, they have the same thing going on with their own organizations. So it's just that it's not about governmental organizations or a city organization. Basically, any other big organization have the same problems, that there are very few people doing this exploration, radically uncertainty, and most normal business is going on in the other corner. And if you don't have a link between them, there will be no impact. So you cannot inject new things. Like, how do you inject sustainability, climate change, if you don't create the connections in here? So it's been very, yeah. Suddenly we were all on the same page and we shared the same experience. And then the next steps get so much clearer.
Yeah. And I think we're starting to see that it's useful to, you will notice in this picture, we have overlaid this zone model, the colored zone model, into the innovation facets model, because it seems like it represents this in some way. We see it, the innovation facets model, you can also view it as a way of moving activities and projects across the zones to like the handovers between the different actors in the innovation ecosystem. In the next couple of minutes, I'm going to run through an attempt at how is it that you evidence impact. And this is a very dangerous topic to say anything about, but I'm going to throw it out there, and you got to start somewhere with these kind of topics. So this is the million-dollar question. How is it that you evidence impact and track this system transformation? These are big deal things. These are long-term things. We were inspired by another program at Vinnova, VinVex program, which works on developing effective regional innovation systems and also aspires towards contributing to addressing the Sustainable Development Goals. They have an annual reporting process called, a part of the annual reporting process called the layer model, where they're requested to report on kind of basically leverage effects of the money that gets invested by Vinnova and the host region, the set of actors in the region, how that gets leveraged to initiate additional projects, how those project actors, partners in the projects, initiate additional activities or projects, which is the third layer. And then the fourth layer is basically a storytelling process tracing of what kind of critical events are happening for that year, that that represent a multi-stakeholder event that has changed the system in some way, a step in the direction that they're taking in their strategy. So by using project investments as a proxy for both seeing how the set of collaborative partners are changing and growing, and the set of funders involved, it's some kind of proxy for gathering force around a particular theme in general. And the important events are kind of these qualitative snapshots of what's going on to kind of trace the story over time. Your kind of impact story, if you want to see it from an academic point of view. And we applied this layer model to Future by Lund in two particular areas. So Future by Lund works with 5 different thematic areas, and this is just a kind of a mapping or an application of the model for mobility and for digitalization. The yellow is the base investment that has come from Vinnova and from the municipality of Lund for the project investment, the innovation platform as a project. The dark blue is the mobility area, and the lighter blue and gray is the digitalization area. The next picture is a zooming in on the digitalization by particular project. So the layer 2 are in the blue. So these are projects where Future by Lund or other kind of departments within the municipality of Lund or actors. The bits in gray are where other partners in the ecosystem, it's their projects initiated, it's their part of other projects. So the area is basically the funding that has been channeled towards addressing and moving forward on the area of digitalization, digital cities and citizens. The list of actors here are the different stakeholders that are involved in these projects, including 13 international partners in 13 different countries, and also a set of funders. So it's both national and EU funding. And then all of this is in Swedish, but it's different kind of events over time, including a visit by the Minister for Infrastructure at a new, well, actually, that's not an event in this particular picture, but it's kind of tracing the events and showing kind of over qualitatively, like the level of complexity that has been achieved and the level of ambition and the steps that have progressively achieved. So it's kind of showing, visualizing this scale up effect of initial activities of working in that fuzzy exploratory front end and how that can be scaled up over time. And that's it for us. And I realize we've gone way over time.
Thank you, both of you. That was really, really fascinating. And it's been fun to watch as you've been applying the facet model in this really interesting way. And I especially appreciate how you're kind of doing this working in between this spectrum of ownership or spectrum of certainty about ownership, let's say, and then looking at this element of time as well and tracking these movements in the portfolio. This work you're doing just to develop a common vocabulary seems very kind of foundational and maybe even rudimentary, but it's so important as this first step, kind of getting everybody to consensus and even being able to start these strategic conversations. And I appreciate Emily going into the danger zone of looking at impact and evidence, because that's always something that is extremely difficult to do. I want to invite, so we're going to do a bit of a panel discussion, but just before we do that, I would like to invite everybody who is a participant to share what innovation portfolio management are you doing? So we heard from 2 examples from Sweden today, and some great examples actually have been shared in the chat as well. So we will be collecting those as well. But we have a bit of a map that we would like you to add some cases. So this is going to inform our research and our case library of innovation management practices out there. So this can be anything from, just one tool in a bigger picture, or maybe an overall strategy for innovation portfolio approaches. But what's kind of going on out there? Where are those emerging practices happening? So if you could take a minute and add a case that you're working on, or practice that you're working on, or even just one that you know about that you think is really important to highlight. And this can be, again, from national government, regional, public, private, not necessarily just government focus, but where is this happening, and where do you think some of these key questions are being addressed? So this link is also in the chat, and we'll keep this link live for a little while as well. And by the way, all the content that's being shared in the chat will also do a kind of summary of this session as well, so we can make sure we get those resources and links out there, because there's some great content. Okay, so to kick us off with this kind of panel discussion, and then we'll take a few questions that are coming in through the Q&A. I want to dive in a little bit more to this question of the role in your ecosystems and your multi-stakeholder environments, and how do you manage a portfolio of innovation within it? So what are your specific tools for kind of getting everyone to the dance floor? How did you even know what was needed? How did you know to act in this particular way in your ecosystem? There was some examples from Future by Lund of this matching, that matching role. So how does that work? How did you know that that was needed? What are the tools at a very practical level that are used for that? And kind of how do you get people on board, not in the kind of classic top-down way of trying to convince people and bring them to your side, but what are your tools for having everyone see the value in their collective efforts? So lots of questions kind of rolled into one, but the main question here is about your role. What is it? How did you know that it was needed? And what does it look like on a day-to-day basis? What tools do you use for this? Maybe if you want to start out with Viable Cities and then go over to Future by Lund and see where that takes us.
All right, so thank you for an excellent question, Angela. And also really inspired by the presentation from Lund. So a lot of thoughts, but when it comes to our role, we sort of tried to come up with a good word about it a couple of weeks ago, and also proposed mission driver. And I think for us, this indicates that we connect. For example, we connect governmental agencies, we connect municipalities, and more, and perhaps most importantly in relation to those, also relating to other portfolios of the needs and challenges, and perhaps some insights that could be related to it. So even though perhaps more than managing, if we could use the word, we perhaps would say coordinate or inspire or create opportunities for collaboration. We do analysis, we push, and so on. But I think one sort of key element that is really important in pretty much everything that we do, it is that we put a high emphasis on the cities. And with the cities, it's just sort of the cities in the wide sense, but we see it from a sort of need-driven perspective, where we have the municipalities at the very center. So with them at the center or behind the steering wheel, we see them as sort of facilitators of this more wider cities and multi-stakeholder approach. So that makes it a bit complex, and then taking this to the national and as well the international level. So to sort of work with this a bit more practically, you heard some examples from Katarina and from OPSI, but I would say that again, that the Climate City Contract is perhaps the most important tool that we have. It's the epicenter of what we do, and we're sort of looking at what the cities have been writing in the Climate City Contract, and perhaps rolling out these type of concepts. This can also influence not only what we do in Sweden, but also in the EU and potentially in other parts of the world. So we're happy to sort of share how we're approaching that, and then sort of building our portfolio strategy on top of it. Another example of a concept that we're developing is, as Katarina mentioned, the Climate Smart Cities Challenge. So this is a way for us to sort of, again, connect across portfolios and across countries. And then we like to work with open calls. So we asked for cities all around the world to work with us. We had no funding available, but had a lot of applications. And now we're working with 4 cities that are really committed and really interested. And these are also outside Sweden. So this helps us to focus a lot of different stakeholders, including other governmental agencies and organizations that we want to connect to and collaborate with. So having these type of really focused initiatives, I think, is key for us. Also, as Katarina mentioned, in order to be able to experiment and learn, and to have concepts such as system demonstrations that can lead towards further investments and so on. But one or perhaps a couple more things if I have the time, Angela. I think, thank you. So I think that sort of as we basically fund projects, that's also another core element of what we do. So this gives us the possibility to use the grant as a lever to trigger innovations in urban governance and so on. And we can learn from the analysis and the dialogues that we have with the cities and other stakeholders in order to influence upcoming grant calls. So this is, of course, very, very important. But I think that these type of initiatives of experimenting and visioning and gather different stakeholder groups and the intermediation role is at the very core of what we do. So there are a lot of things to mention around it, but I can have follow-up details, but not to take this into a too long monologue. I leave the word back to you, Angela.
Great. Yeah, as this, we're looking more at these portfolios, the action verbs will also need to diversify. But I like this, the concept you originally mentioned in your response, this mission drivers, and it's something that I want to come back to after we hear a bit from Future by Lund, because I think this is a really important, leads to an important question that was also asked in the Q&A. Katarina, and Emily, can you tell us a little bit more about how you think about your role in the ecosystem, and what are some tools that you use in how you do your portfolio work?
Yeah, I was sitting when you said the question, what do you do on a daily basis? And well, kind of $1 million question, but the thing is that you always try, you have your mandate level, so that then you have your thinking, what do we need to push this? And actually, this is a very much working with persons and relations in regard to the bigger structures. So you always have to design your actions on like, how can we help this person to achieve that, to change the system? And that could be anything. So I spend loads of days drinking coffee and having meetings and constantly asking, what do you need? And if they don't know, perhaps we should set up something so we can create that understanding of what is needed. And if someone knows what they need, perhaps you need to do some matching, or you need to inject something, a pre-study or anything. So it's this constant moving of what is needed. And that drives what happens when you can create these actions in regards to people's vision and wants, is when you start moving things, the energy goes up and the train starts moving by itself. And then you have to jump off. This is a facilitation role. You need to know when to push and when to not to, and when to leave, and accept that you are not owning anything. So the whole credibility of what we do is transparency, and that is, I think, the biggest city advantage, that we are neutral. We don't earn money on this. We don't create anything. We don't own anything. And that is why we can go into and move in the gaps between the business, the city, the university, because we are the neutral ones. So it's also about our role of not get on top of things. And the other thing, the problem with being a city is that you have politics and other rules. So it's also about leveling, what do you need? What's the rules here? It's very pragmatic work. And you take one step by one. So one foot in front of the others. That's what we do on a daily basis. And that's why we need a team. Emily with the research, Peter, who is the tech guy. So you also need to understand who is to move into this and help out now. Yeah, you need to like this because you need to understand that someone will punch you in the face all the time because you will enter a stop And then you probably need some good colleagues that sort of takes care of you and comforts you, and then you get back on the track again. And then, yeah. So it's also about a certain kind of partnerships that is needed between everyone. It's okay to not succeed.
This sounds like a dangerous role.
It is.
I like to add on another one there. I think you guys are like idea trackers, and like these, you're in the constant continuous drinking of coffee and individual meetings. Like they kind of field out and they track these ideas, and they kind of capture them, and then, okay, what can we do with this? It's not just hearing and listening, but okay, how can we, like Katarina was saying, what can we do to move this forward? Does this have potential? Is it relevant? And how can we act to move this forward? And another thing that Katarina mentioned that I want to like reinforce is that it's a team of people working part-time on this, like 7 people with different complementary skills. And some of them are working very much in the kind of the technical end of things with energy systems and with digital systems and building and things like this. But also there's a good part of the team, Katarina included, working on building the social capital within the ecosystem, working with entrepreneurs and working with the kind of the creative and these kind of more softer aspects of ensuring an effective ecosystem. So it's not just about doing technical things together, but it's doing, willing to do understanding together, building a common value system and what you're trying, not only what you're trying to achieve, but how you aim to achieve it. And that's also an important aspect. And I think it's a bit unique for Future by Lund as an innovation platform.
Actually, my partner, my colleague Peter, he always says, if we can get all our partners, all the 113, 120, to get into a barbecue together, then we know that we have succeeded, because then the impact will happen. If you put people who want something in the same room or in the same place, they will do it. And then we can put the layers and the infrastructure and the models around them to support them, but we need to get them there. So we always have this barbecue model in our heads, because then you can capture the feeling of when we are going to succeed. Because when the feeling comes first, then you know that then you can push, and then you can add almost anything. So it's sort of.
Well, I didn't have barbecues on my key levers of portfolio management toolbox, but that is sounds like it's a very effective one. I want to ask, I want to combine one of the questions that was asked in the chat with a question that I have for both of you about, so you have this portfolio, you have these snapshots. What are your plays, if you want to call them that, for transitioning the portfolio in a direction or toward an overarching goal? And the question in the chat was, it's related to this kind of mission-oriented portfolio logic that you both seem to be working with, and whether that was kind of a given and how that either helps or hinders maybe how you think about transitioning your portfolio, and like how does that play into your work? So what are your plays? How does that transitioning of the portfolio work? What are the tools for that? And then if you can maybe address this kind of mission-oriented logic that was asked in the chat as well. Let's do the same. Let's start with viable cities and then to Future by Lund, and then fill in if there's anything we missed in the discussion.
I'm seriously starting to think about sort of climate neutral barbecues as one of our key plays. Perhaps we should have the first one in Lund. So I think I presented, and also Åsa and Katarina, some key plays from us before. But I think that our most important play is that we do have a mission. So this sets the direction, and then we could sort of be pretty methodology agnostic around it, or at least allow a lot of different methodologies, because we're working with so many different stakeholders. But I think it's sort of important to point out that everything that we do is in relation to this mission of climate neutral cities by 2030 with a good life for everyone within the planetary boundaries. Also, I talked about the transition lab as the sort of the backbone structure of what we do. But again, you know, when we work with this type of mission, it's perhaps something else than the type of mission of a moon landing. It's sort of wider. And even if it's to some extent clear what we want to achieve, I would say that we need to also focus on some specific challenge areas that are especially important for the transition. One of the examples is sort of collaborating with other relevant actors for learning and for sort of aligning resources and so on. So my colleague Katarina, she talked about our collaboration with Drive Sweden, the sibling innovation program focusing on mobility. And the background for the collaboration that we have with Drive Sweden is that up to 95% of the carbon emissions in cities comes from mobility in Sweden. It looks a bit differently from city to city, and sort of the general figure is like 1/3 of carbon emissions comes from transportation within the country. But we have, just to give a glimpse on how we're working with this as a sort of a play at this point beyond this type of collaboration, we get tightly linked with Drive Sweden. We connect to our related governmental agencies such as Vinnova and the Swedish Energy Agency. And then again, tapping back to what I said earlier, that we sort of put the municipalities in the driver's seats, we ask them to define sort of their key challenges. And this is something that has been stated already within the Climate City contract. So we asked them to sort of further build on this and expand on what they've mentioned within the mobility field in the Climate City contract. And then we asked them to sort of work within a similar or same format really to prioritize their needs. The needs in relation to organizational government, citizen engagement, cooperation between the state and the municipalities, the coordination of funding, community planning, scaling of solutions. And interestingly, when we asked this, sort of finding the solutions which could be more of a type of tech type of solutions, that is a bit on the lower end of the priority list as we see it now, which is pretty interesting because quite often we tend to sort of focus more on the tech, but the real hinders or the barriers in the way could be more on perhaps policy level or investment level and so on. So focusing like this on specific challenge areas in relation to the mission, this gives us a common ground. And I would say that the sort of the capacity building and how we're working with this on top of it, including innovation management, is at the very core of what we want to achieve. But this is our thinking now, and it's how it's developing. I would like at some point in the future, perhaps within a year or so, to sort of have a shared database or a way of sort of defining the different problems, challenges in a way that is really open and transparent. Because if we have this across different type of portfolios, then it would be so much easier to have this common language and to connect between our different initiatives, because too many things are sort of developed at the same time with the sort of the same design pretty much. So we need to be a bit smarter in how we're working.
Great, thank you for that. Lund, do you have a perspective to add on these plays? And then I have a follow-up question about back to after this for Viable Cities about the international collaboration that came up in the chat. But yeah, in the short term, I know in Lund, some of your collaborators even are maybe sports coaches in their personal life, and they use these this practice of drawing the little diagrams and transitioning the portfolios like it's actual plays on a playing field. Would you tell us a little bit more about that practice and what does that look like in Lund?
Emily?
I'll start off and then I want you to fill in. But yeah, so Peter is a soccer coach and he envisioned that these kind of conversations would take place with other partners and at Future by Lund in the sense of, so the innovation facets model and seeing activities on a common visual or common playing field could amount to like, okay, well, where would we want this to go? So it just kind of moving this activity here, where do we want to move it there? And to do this, what would we need? And Katarina facilitated one of those discussions with a partner this past Monday. And she, in fact, did draw up. It was like boxing in and an arrow, we want to move it there, and what do we need to do that? And kind of listing out the types of functions that were necessary, the types of collaborations with other organizations that would be necessary, and discussing, well, why isn't that there now? And what could one do to kind of move that thing in the direction that you want to move that, and discussing why is it a priority for your organization, and basically, as Katarina said, what can we do to help? What can we do to move that piece into a different zone?
And the whole thing about this is to understand what is needed, so you can actually provide, because there is not one company today or one organization who doesn't have at least parts of the same mission that we all share about sustainability, about climate, about other things. It's just how can you make it happen, and the logic is different. So by understanding the drives, the keys, the needs, the wants, and perhaps also help them to see what is what, we can actually say, well, in this part you align with Bible City, in this part you align with your and this part you align with that. So how can we make this happen? Because very often the sort of connections is blurry, because we don't know what is the drive for everyone. So okay, we have a climate contract in Lund. What does it mean? How can Siemens, how can Tetra Pak, how can Axis, how can the university connect to that? Well, to know that, we need to know what they want. And then when we have put this together, we can actually tie the knots, and we can identify what kind of action is needed to make this happen. And then they need to know that we want to help them. Because the next thing that happens is that group of people that we're working with, they have to go home and convince their own management that this is a good thing. Because we would like to have all the CEOs of all the companies to do their own climate contract. But that's not happening, because they are also into business. So we need to decipher when, where, what. And as soon as this happens, it's basically get on with it, because we have the same goals, but they are different language, they are situated in different positions. So we actually need to sort of bug it down and find where it is. And when it happens, we can step out and let the right levels handle it. That is one of the beauties of doing this. You can actually see that it is possible. So that's amazing, actually.
Åsa, did you want to weigh in on this as well?
Just really shortly, I was so happy that you said this, Katarina, because I think one important aspect, which is an interconnection that is really strong between what you're doing in Lund and in other cities, and the kind of whole logic of viable cities, is that we need to be really humble towards the different context. Växjö, which is a small city, is very, very different from Gothenburg, both in terms of what companies are there, what knowledge institutions are there, how is civil society organized, and what political decision-making processes and frameworks are in place. So we need to meet the cities and the stakeholders in the wider context in the cities with a lot of humbleness and humility, and face them where they're at to drive things forward.
This is a bit related to something that came up in the chat here, is, you know, collaborating with stakeholders that are outside your organization, maybe even outside of Sweden, in the EU, for instance. And what does that mean for the practical process of moving transitions ahead? And how does this diversity of stakeholders and interests and context complicate the work? Do you have any reflections on that, or maybe some tips or tools that maybe you've learned through hard-won battles? I see that. Let's go to Ola, Katarina, and I think Åsa. You have something to say about this. So this is going to be a juicy discussion.
So it's interesting. I mean, as you saw from our presentation, that we're sort of focusing on Sweden. So I think that's important to know for in our program, and the cities that are part of it are Swedish. But that said, 99% of innovation is basically happening outside Sweden. So to connect to international portfolios is really important, and also with the mission of climate neutral cities, that doesn't have any boundaries. On the opposite, we really want to sort of support this on an international level as well. So one really quick comment first on the EU level is that our former chairman, Mr. Allan Larsson, once finance minister in Sweden, he was also at the mission board of climate neutral cities at the EU level. So this type of sort of direct in-person connections between Sweden and the EU helps, of course. Then there are many different viewpoints you could have on our international work, but I would say that sort of our experiences within the Climate Smart Cities Challenge, as this was also raised by my colleague Katarina, there are a few elements here that I think could be interesting as sort of like practical recommendations, perhaps, because yes, it's messy, because especially since the type of innovation program that we have quite limited sort of personal resources, so we need to work smartly. So I think first, working with open calls helps in order to find those that are interested. So now we have cities in Brazil, Uganda, Colombia, and in the UK, and that we also had the help from the Nesta challenges in UK to help us design the first open call. But that we actually work more on the ground with UN Habitat. So UN Habitat and Viable Cities wrote a memorandum of understanding about collaboration. So with their mandate of SDG number 11, and also that they have both like a policy type of mandate, and that they can work directly with the local government is really important. So this helps a lot in terms of knowledge and in terms of sort of being there. But then another thing is that we're connecting this to the World Expo in Dubai to sort of further strengthening the momentum. So this gives us the sort of strength to further connect to the Swedish ecosystem. So we're now working with some of our key governmental agencies, other governmental agencies that we haven't worked so much with before, as well as some of our big company members. So if you remember that we have more than 100 members, and such as Scania, for example. So Scania is particularly in interest of the sort of the Bogota in Colombia challenge on freight logistics. So once we then go into these type of details, then we can connect to the ecosystems in the countries and build on the national bilateral collaborations that we have. So Vinnova in Brazil has a long-term relations that we can sort of further build on. We work with many of the foreign missions, meaning the Swedish embassies in the countries, and also further connect to other initiatives that are already ongoing. So having these type of focused efforts where we can tap into existing things that are already happening and then working with international actors such as UN Habitat is really important for us to be able to work more directly outside Sweden as well. But there's a lot of more things to say, but I think this, considering what has already been said, this would be my my top comments.
Katarina, you wanted to weigh in on this as well.
Yeah, I'm just saying that sort of we are not the best in the class. So you need to go international. You need to find those who are doing interesting things and meet up with them and learn from them, and then take it back and adapt it to your own environment. Because otherwise you need to reinvent everything. So it's like basically steal like an artist, find the best practices, talk with people who has done it. And sometimes it's even better to go internationally because there is no competition between institutions, organizations, or cities or whatever. So you can talk much freely and you can learn much faster. So I'm just saying from the sort of impact level, also sharing research. Emily, you are a sort of example of this, of bringing in your international networks and actually bring in the latest best practice from somewhere and just, well, that's why we're here with you in the international context. So I think that is key for actually succeeding, to have this outlook. It should always include an international level.
Great. I want to move back into this topic of the evaluation of impact, which is always the treacherous territory, but really interesting for this topic. And I'm wondering how you go about that. You both said a little bit about that, but I'm wondering if you can dig in a bit more. How do you link the impact of the activities with the management of the portfolio that you're doing? How does that actually work in practice? There was a question also in the chat about whether this is consistent with a collective impact approach. So if you're familiar with that, maybe you can address that. And also, how do you link it to the more traditional program evaluation and quality improvement practices that might also exist in parallel to the work that you're doing? So a lot of questions in one, but really want to dive into this topic of impact evaluation and what evidence do you collect? How do you use it? How do you monitor? What does that look like in practice? Maybe we'll start with OPSI and then over to Emily. Let's hear more about that.
Yes, this is a really interesting and important question. However, I think that when we talk about transformative change, we talk about mission-oriented approaches to driving innovation efforts for achieving impact. It's really kind of difficult to use the standard models in terms of how do we evaluate impact. We had a discussion that was actually starting off even 2 years ago in 2019, which is about how do we monitor transformative change? How do we monitor not only the results? If you're really kind of simplistic, you could think about our mission about, it's about CO2 emissions, cutting CO2 emissions. But if you think about the mission, climate neutral cities with a good life for all within planetary boundaries, that actually encompasses both the SDGs and the Paris Agreement agenda, if you will. And you can drive that down to the national, the local level, or even the city district level. But still, it's not only about how do we achieve what we aim for, is how do we build the muscle for achieving transformative change? How do we empower and enhance our collective learning capacity and our capacity for driving transformative change? And we have the opportunity and the great privilege to work with researchers on these topics. So this is ongoing work. But I would say that our Climate City contract also encompasses, in the continuous relief revisions that we will do yearly, a strand on how do we learn how to evaluate in a proper way that is actually appropriate to a missions-oriented approach, which is not about did we succeed in this and that particular endeavor, but it's more about how do we work together in a more systematic way? How can we mobilize all the actors that are relevant in the city of Lund and the stakeholders around the city of Lund and the cities around Sweden in order to empower their efforts together with national stakeholders and all kinds of other efforts, including policy efforts, behavioral change and norms, and different types of, I would say, innovation processes than we usually think about when we talk about research and innovation efforts.
Emily, do you want to weigh in as well?
Do I want to or do I have to? This topic is such a black box. It's so complex, and this is kind of my area of research. The question being, how is it that you can evaluate transformative innovation programs? And that's a completely unanswered question. It's research is an ongoing, and I weigh in on it that I'm not sure that you can evaluate. I think that you can track transformative change processes in a structured way. I think establishing kind of the aims, it's part of establishing your strategic direction. Where is it that you're wanting to go with this group in this context? And then it's also about weighing in on, okay, well, what do we think are appropriate kind of indicators of success, or that we're going in the right direction, to kind of be able to say, okay, do we need to press the pedal a little bit harder? Do we need to like change tact a little bit? It's about it's developmental evaluation or formative evaluation. It's informing the strategic change process. I'm not sure how to go about evaluating if it's enough for, I mean, I know that the missions have concrete goals of you need to get down to this amount of emission in this territory. I'm not sure that these types of ecosystems are, you can delimit them in that way. I think it's very difficult. So I'm more of a process tracking and inclusive kind of agreement on where is it that we're wanting to go and what do we think are indicators of change, and then following that in a structured way so that one can continuously go back to the people investing their time and resources and saying, okay, this is how far we've gotten and we're all part of the whole game together. Are we happy? You know, where do we need to change? So I'm very much of a qualitative weighing in on this topic. But it's an unanswered question, and it's very interesting to see, hear how everybody else is doing it as well.
Yeah, there's some discussion in the chat about the type of feedback and maybe different forms beyond the typically quantitative measures, such as, you know, did we reduce our carbon? So for instance, that's very, very easy to measure, but some other things are definitely not. And related to this topic of evaluation, measurement, particularly for these things that are a bit exploratory or you don't see the impact in a short amount of time, there's a question related to political communication. So you all have a kind of overall mandate, although the details of how are very much up to you and those working in your ecosystem to achieve them. But sometimes the work that you do may not seem immediately directed toward the goal, may result in some, you know, invisible results or maybe some unusual results. And oftentimes politicians have to deal with the kind of critique for some of those exploratory projects. So there's a question about, you know, not only how do you evaluate, how do you tell the story, but how does that feed back to this kind of political dimension and the kind of legitimacy of your approach? How do you keep that legitimacy, particularly for such long-term goals and for transitions of the portfolio that take maybe a little bit longer time? Does anyone want to take a first stab at that hot potato question? Katarina, you have your hand up.
Yeah, sort of, it's exactly in this sort of particular question that you are in need of sort of the new policies from EU, from governmental level, because that is the overruling thing that you can point. Because when you get down to city level, it's sort of, well, today we have the problem with the school, and there is someone with this elderly care home that is debating. So the questions, political questions on city level can be very fluctuating. And then you need something bigger to hold on to also make it is not sort of help the politicians on local level to also point to their own sort of members or the citizens that this is an overall goal. This is higher up in the ranking. So I think there is the most important level to keep the flag post down in the ground to help us to sort of relay the mandate somewhere. Mm-hmm. And I think that is also why, if we can't do that, if you can't sort of there, you can push with a little bit of money, with some, you need the handshakes and the cutting of ribbons, and you need all these kind of things to create this possibility. Because on city level, it's very down to earth matters, and there you can like flip a coin and everything changes. So I'm just saying that here is and to those who sit on this level, think of this is your by proxy. This is what we need you to do to be able to work. Without that, it doesn't work.
Awesome.
And I like the way you express it, Katarina, saying that you need to keep the stick in the ground and relay the mandate. And that is, I would say that is really what we try to do within Viable Cities in order to kind of legitimize the process at the city level. Politicians, they have a lot of other things to deal with in the political process than necessarily climate and sustainability transition. And we can see that in the Corona crisis, although we've been very happy to see that actually the cities are really kind of on task in terms of driving this change, but creating the legitimacy in at the local level. And I think that one thing that is really key also is that it's not only about climate transition, it's also about creating better daily lives for citizens. So it's about multiple purposes, multiple outcomes. And I think that if we think only about kind of, I could turn the question about the international level on around a little bit from before, because in a way, the fact that we have a collective framework from the global level relating to climate and sustainability work down to kind of the city level or even a kind of small neighborhood, it actually can emphasize that this is not something that we do only here, where I live, where I work, where I am, but it's something that we do together on different scale. So really kind of keeping the stick in the ground and helping processes to be legitimized is really, really key. And I think within Viable Cities, the fact that we have mobilized in each of the cities, the political leadership to drive this process has been a really key point in our work.
And can I just add there, because it's right here, it comes back to the innovation facet model. Because to be able to do this, we need to do risky things. And to do that, we need to explain why we do these different things and who is doing what and what the portfolio is. So by creating this language and this way of looking at things, where things are, how they stick together, where things happening, is a huge help to create this language that also is helping us sort of keeping the stick in the ground on different levels, because we can see ourselves as part of the portfolio. We can see our different, I'm working here, but you're working here and you're working here. And this is valuable because we are valuable together. So this is why we got hooked on the portfolio model. We could actually use this to explain that we are all needed, the mission, the downside. And it's sort of, it's that soccer field where you have to put up your team and you have different tasks. So for me, it all ends back to your model as a help creating this. So
well, you make it sound a little bit like a drug, getting hooked on, Katarina. But thanks for both of those perspectives. I want to make sure we hear a little bit from Katarina from Viable Cities, because she's got an example to share of this kind of learning history approach, which I think is quite relevant to portfolio, innovation portfolio stewardship. And then I want to wrap up with the final question. Over to you, Katarina.
Yeah, it's actually a little bit coming back to the previous question we discussed about the evaluation, which is, as my colleague said, and everyone said, it's a very difficult question. But if we think about learning as something valuable which emerged during this process, then we, of course, can also try to address this like more seriously and really then ask the question, okay, but then how we can work with learnings in a more also structured and a clear way. And then we have now one kind of experimentation process, which my colleague is doing. She's also a researcher, and she's trying to test and in collaboration with cities to try so-called learning history approach. And this is really interesting. It's a new practice which is interesting in itself, but I think what is even more interesting is how this practice can become really part of normal like work of, for example, municipalities, because it requires really doing this type of reflexivity sessions or like workshops when you maybe come together and you try to reflect on what is actually happening, what we can learn from our practice. And this is good that, okay, now we are testing it as more like experimentations, and 3 cities are involved as a test beds for this. But it would be really nice to see how it can be really like institutionalized in those cities and become not an experimentation process, but really this is how we work. We have those reflexivity sessions, and this is why they are valuable and how they accelerate our learning. So I think it's a very maybe interesting perspective in this context if we take learning seriously.
Great, thanks so much, Katarina. In the interest of time, I think we'll have to wrap up for today. I wanted to get to this question, which we may actually address in a community of practice meetup, which is what else remains to be done in this emerging practice. So we have a lot of questions answered, but a lot more questions raised from today and from your work. So I think I'll leave the panel discussion at that. I want to share just quickly some tools. I'd be remiss if I didn't do a little promo for some of the tools that OPSI has to share on portfolio management. So there's a innovation portfolio exploration workshop, which is a kind of gamified resource you can download and print or even use online in our times currently. This workshop to make sense of your portfolio from a project perspective in this case, and then test different transitions and play shock cards and against your portfolio and look at different assets that you could leverage. So this is something that's available for download on our website. There's also a self-service portfolio exploration tool for taking a quick snapshot of how your support structures and your activities might push your portfolio in certain directions. And then there's a portfolio exploration tool guide for running discussions around this topic. So the website for, you can access all of those things by going to the website listed here. And then I'd invite everybody who is here today, including our panelists and all of our attendees, to join our portfolio practice. We're going to be hosting a meetup on this topic to explore these unanswered questions and to try to advance this practice a bit more and share some lessons learned that we didn't have time to get into today. So I'd invite everybody to use the link in the chat or email us directly and ask. This hasn't been scheduled yet, so but we'll let you know via email when it is. So with that, I'd like to thank all of our panelists today for providing their case background. I think these are really, really great examples to ground this practice of innovation portfolio stewardship in real world examples from your cases. And it was really nice to dig into the details and get to those, even the treacherous questions with all of you today. So thanks for your contributions today, and we look forward to the next discussion about innovation portfolio management. For everyone who wants to continue on this topic, this is going to be an ongoing area of research for the OECD Observatory of Public Sector Innovation, with a report with these cases and others included, and that will be published later this year. So stay tuned and please let us know if you have cases to share and examples from practice, such as the one shared today. So thanks everybody. Have a great rest of your day and keep doing the good work you're doing on innovation portfolio stewardship.